I'm deciding whether to comment on this first. The other day when we were talking about whether Israel was there historically or not, and I talked to you about a community of scholars more in Europe than in the US, but some in the US, who say Israel wasn't there, Judah wasn't there, it was all made up by Jews arriving in the land around the time of Ezra, and they made up a history, they invented it in order to justify their coming in and taking the land, which is to say, taking the land from the legitimate residents. And I said, I don't know what their motives are, and it's true, they have a great variety of motives, but some of them I know. I mean, their motives, they're reading the present Middle East into the past Middle East. They believe present-day Israel is Jews arriving from elsewhere, claiming they have a history in the land when they don't, in order to take the land from the legitimate Palestinian residents. Whatever you think of that in 2014, what they're doing is popping that back to 500-something BCE and even 1000 BCE and saying the history wasn't there. It's the Jews up to their old tricks. They were already doing it back then, making up a history when they had no history in that land. Now, the reason I didn't go into that last time is because I said it was only a presentation of the evidence, and if the people presenting their case have good motives or bad motives, still doesn't change us as scholars. Our job is to check the evidence. People can come to the right answer for bad motives. People can come to the wrong answer when they have good motives. So I usually don't go into that. But it bothered me it does bother me. I've sat in the room with some of these people, a couple of the ones who I don't doubt that is their motive. Then I was driving along here the other day, and on the radio, NPR referred to, in Jerusalem, they said, this took place on the noble sanctuary, which Jews call the Temple Mount. Now, they used to report it on the news as, this took place on the Temple Mount, which Muslims refer to as the noble sanctuary. Whether you think that was right or wrong, I think that was a perfectly legitimate statement. I will say, it's the Temple Mount, but I understand that Muslims refer to it where the mosque is as noble sanctuary. But they switched it. They said it's the noble sanctuary, which Jews refer to as the Temple Mount. It is not that Jews refer to it as the Temple Mount. Also, it is Jews and Christians who refer to it as the Temple Mount. And as you may have noticed, there's a lot more Christians in the world than Jews or anybody else. And it's not that somebody refers to it. That saying it like that placed a doubt, as if, and it's part of a present day political argument debate where people who are hostile to Israel say there never was a temple on that mount. Now that's a lie. That's no longer a matter of whether I'm questioning the motives of anybody for a particular position. But NPR, which is a radio station that is hostile to Israel, reports the Temple Mount as if it's just something that people call it. Part of the temple is still there, it's not, you can't miss the western wall or the southern wall, which were not walls of the building, they were the lower wall, but the record is, that's not debatable. So you're all going to have to deal with that we're studying things that happened 3,000 years ago and 2,500 years ago, and present-day political arguments are coloring the views people take of that. And for those of us who do this as scholars, that's painful. And for those of us who see scholars among us doing that, that's just reprehensible. And I would name names. There's no point in doing it here and now. Anybody want to come and see me? I'll tell you the names. And it's just terrible. If you ever catch me doing it, you should tell me. But you won't. because I don't. So, all right. Now, that'd be true in any course you take. But this could have been chemistry, and I would have given you the same message. It's just when it's the Bible, you know, somehow that adds an extra layer because the Bible is charged. And whatever your views are about the modern Middle East, try, if you can, to keep it out of your interpretations of the Bible, unless it's something relevant, where the Bible says you should treat people X way, and then you say, well, are they treating people that way? That's legitimate. So, our title today is The Death of the Gods, or Why a Monotheistic God Speaks in the Plural. Our story starts in Deuteronomy 32:8. That is the song that Moses gives the people to sing, that he said will be a witness against them in the future because it contains certain messages. And one line in particular is verse 8 that I want you to read. In Deuteronomy 32, it says, when the highest, refers to God by this term for God, Hebrew Elyon, which would mean the highest, which already doesn't sound as monotheistic as you might like. Highest out of what? When the highest gave nations legacies, when he dispersed humankind, he set the people's borders to the number of the children of Israel. When he set up the countries, he set the borders of all the countries according to the number of the children of Israel. And you go, one country for every Israelite? That's a lot of countries. And that was always a troubling verse. And one interpretation of it was, to try to make some sense of it, was at the beginning of Exodus, it says that Jacob, whose name is also Israel, right, goes down to Egypt with 70 souls. And they said, so that's the children of Israel. It's the ones who went down to Egypt, and there's 70 of them, and there were 70 nations in ancient times. So he set the borders of the nations according to the number of children of Israel. What is wrong with that picture? There's 540-something references to the term children of Israel in the Torah. Why pick that one at the beginning of Exodus and say, that's the one? It's not the one where there's 603,550 guys. It's the one where there's 70. And secondly, when in the history of the earth do we know that there were exactly 70 nations? Where the heck did that came from? They picked that to go with the 70 in the verse that they picked. So this is a problem, always. What did the verse mean? And then, in 1947, this goat makes the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century, the Dead Sea Scrolls. So now we have an alternative reading of that verse. It says, when the highest gave nations legacies, except it says it in Hebrew, because they didn't speak English 2,000 years ago. I know, you're going to say, but my Bible's in English. They must have, but you know what I mean. It says, when the highest gave nations legacies, when he dispersed humankind, he set the people's borders to the number of the children of Elohim. Instead of B'nai Yisrael, the children of Israel, it says B'nai Elohim, the sons of the gods, which are the gods. Now, whichever you think is right, we've seen other cases of this where the Hebrew text, the Greek text, and the Dead Sea Scroll text read differently, and we try to figure out which is the original. In this case, you got to admit that one does make a heck of a lot more sense. If he set the borders of all the nations according to the number of the B'nai Elohim, the children of the gods, that means like he went like, okay, Greece, where's Zeus? Zeus, you take Greece. Marduk, you get Babylon. Ashur, you get Assyria. And he gives out he sets the borders according to the number of the gods. Each country gets its chief god. And then the next verse is, But Yahweh's portion is Israel. So he kept Israel. That was going to be the country that he took. Well, you want to go for best of three. The Greek text, the Septuagint, says, when the highest gave nations legacies, when he dispersed humankind, he set the people's borders to the number of the children of the angels. And you go, oh, great, thank you so much. That helps a lot. And you go, now wait. There's no way that it would have the word Israel or it would have the word gods there, and a scribe would mistake it and write angels. This is a conscious decision. The Greek translators sometimes, when they come to the B'nai Elohim, the sons of the gods, will turn it into the angels of God, because that's what they think it refers to. They don't believe there are gods, so they're making a decision based on their theology that these must be angels. And so if you look at the beginning of the book of Job, too, there's a reference to all the gods being present around God. And in the Greek text of the book of Job, it says it was all the angels. Which is to say, the Greek text has the same text as the Dead Sea Scroll text. Now, that's 2 out of 3. But as we've seen before, you don't determine the truth by democratic vote. I believe in truth. I believe in democracy. But you don't determine truth by holding a vote. But it does happen, though, that in this case, you do have 2 out of the 3 sources have this, and it makes more sense, and it relates better to the verse that comes after it. So at the very minimum, you have to say the more likely reading is that it's the gods, not one country for every Israelite. And you go, but that means there's gods. That means nothing less than the Song of Moses at the end of the Torah. It's referring to there being gods at the time that God set up the world. Well, where else do you get that? We've seen some verses during this course where questions were raised about it. In Exodus 15, the Song of the Sea, right, one of the oldest things in the Bible, it says, "Who is like you among the gods?" It's a famous Hebrew line, "Mi chamocha ba'elim, Yahweh." Who is like you among the gods? And if you look at the English translations of that, you will see an exercise in hiding from what a text says. A lot of the English translations say, "Who is like you among the mighty, O Lord?" Some say, "Who is like you among the gods who are worshipped?" In other words, who are worshipped isn't there. They're adding that, meaning people think that they're gods, but of course they're not. And you're going, well, that's fine, but that's not what's in the text. And there's a whole bunch of other possible translations if you look at the great range of them. And it's not simply a translation problem, it's a meaning problem. So people who know Hebrew and they read it, they still don't know what to do with that. Who is like you among the gods? There aren't supposed to be any. Or take Psalm 29. Psalm 29 says, "Give to Yahweh, you sons of the gods." Havu Adonai, give to Yahweh, B'nai Elim. You gods. It's telling all the other gods to, grant honor to God. And you go, how can this be? How can there be these other gods in the book that we credit with sort of giving monotheism to the world? Even if you recognize that there was an Egyptian monotheism, the one under the Pharaoh Akhenaten, that came earlier, but it only lasted that one generation. When he died, it died. And people argue whether it was really monotheism or not. It probably was, but the problem is we don't have a whole lot of texts in it, and it didn't continue as a living religion, so it's hard to know. Whereas with Israelite religion, you've got the Bible and inscriptions and a whole history to work with. So, how can the Bible have other gods, and where did they go? Psalm 82. Quite possibly the most important psalm in the Bible. Here's the text. We'll read the whole thing of Psalm 82. God is standing in the divine council. He's standing in the council of El, literally. He judges among the gods. That's really what it says. In Hebrew, it's among the Elohim. He judges. Again, look at the English and you won't believe. Take out 10 English Bibles and they'll say he judges among the mighty, he judges among the gods who are worshipped, he judges among, my favorite, there's one that says he judges among the judges, because there's one passage in the Bible where judges are referred to as like God. So they take that and they plug it in here where they've got a God where they don't really want that. But the text says, I mean, you're all, those of you who've never taken a day of Hebrew, just, you know enough from this course. When it says he judges among the Elohim, you know what that means. So apparently it's a scene in wherever it is that the gods live, and here's God standing among them. And here's this judging that he does. He says, how long will you judge falsely and favor the wicked? Judge the poor and the orphan. Justify the lowly and the weak. Adjudicate the poor and the indigent. Save them from the hands of the wicked. So he's criticizing the other gods for not doing a good job of godding. They've been bad judges. They've been unjust. Verse 5. They don't know. They don't understand. They walk in darkness. All the foundations of the earth melt. The whole universe has gone wrong. And so in the next verse he starts, therefore, rendering judgment. And here's the judgment. I had said, you are gods and children of Elyon. B'nai Elyon, children of the highest, all of you. But like a human, you will die. And like one of the rulers, you will fall. Arise, God, judge the earth, because you distribute or give inheritance to all the nations. And that's it. He just killed them. This is Israel's myth of the death of the gods. It doesn't mean that he pulls out a magic divine sword and chops off the heads of all the other gods in that moment. But he's taken away their immortality, which means gradually all the gods, like humans, will die. It's explicit. Like a human, you will die. Now, my concern is a little different from most. Often when people talk about monotheism in ancient Israel, their big argument is, when did Israel become monotheistic? Does it start at Hezekiah or at Josiah or at David or at Moses, or is it only in the second temple period, the first temple period? My issue for the moment is, whenever Israel became monotheistic, whenever the prophets saying there's only one God start to get through, and that side starts to win, and people are starting to buy into the idea that there really is only one God, how do they explain their past? How did you tell your kids there's only one God when they know perfectly well that grandma worshipped many gods? So that's what I'm interested in here. Now here is this myth of the death of the gods. And you notice how it relates to what was going on in the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32. In both of them, God is referred to as Elyon, the highest, and both of them make it that it has to do with God being the one who distributes the portions to all the nations in the world. And we'll just throw in for the moment that it also pictures God as a judge who judges the other gods. Now, this is not some little known item. I mean, Deuteronomy 32 is the big finish of the Torah. It's the song Moses gives at the end. Psalm 82 is a well-known psalm. It's especially well-known among religious Jews because there are 7 psalms that are picked out of the 150 in the book of Psalms, and they're Psalm of the Day. And it happens every Tuesday for the last couple thousand years. Religious Jews have read the Psalm for Tuesday, which is Psalm 82, the one we just read. So it's not one that people haven't noticed in the book of Psalms. It's above average. It's up there like, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. It's one of the biggies. All right, let's consider then this possibility that Israel's religion in biblical times was there used to be gods, but now they're all gone. They gradually died, and now there is only one God. So now we come to the question, a separate one, which will turn out to be not separate, which is, why does God speak in the plural? I brought it up to you way back when we studied the first chapters of Genesis, and I said we would get to that in lecture 24. That's now. All questions are answered. It's a famous thing that God speaks in the plural. For example, at creation, God says, let us make humans in our image. In the Garden of Eden, after the humans eat from the tree, God says, here the human has become like one of us. And at the story of the Tower of Babylon, or Tower of Babel, as some people call it, God says, let us go down and confuse their language there, and then he creates all the languages and the nations separately and all that. Now, you've heard the various reasons probably that people give for why God would speak in the plural. One say that it is the royal we, like there was quote Queen Elizabeth in England who says, we are not amused, and I was quoting, we scholars have our own way of doing it. You never say, I don't know. You say, we don't know. Graciously sharing our ignorance with our colleagues. That's called the royal we. Various people have come up with various other answers. But what's wrong with all the answers is that they don't account for the fact that those three examples I gave you of when God speaks in the plural are the only three in the Bible. People are just very aware of it because they come up right at the beginning. But in Genesis 1 and Genesis 3 and Genesis 11, those are the only times God speaks in the plural in the Bible. There are one or two that people debate, but those three are not, there they are. Now, why would God speak in the plural at creation, at the Garden of Eden, and at the Tower of Babel, and then never do it again? What happens at the Tower of Babel? What's in that story? That is when God distributes the portions to the nations. That is where God creates the nations. He disperses people so they're no longer all in one place, but they're spread out all over the earth, and they speak different languages. It's the same thing that's happening in Psalm 82 and in Deuteronomy 32. So God only speaks in the plural up until this point because there are people to talk, there are gods to talk to at this point. That also answers classic questions like when it says God creates male and female in the divine image. If one of the possible meanings of that means it's something physical, like God has a hands and a face and all, what exactly does that mean that both men and women are created in the image of God? That conjures up some very strange pictures in our minds. But it's not a problem if there's gods and goddesses still. And God says, let us create humans in our image. And the girls look like the goddesses and the boys look like the gods. So, then you take that story in Genesis 6 that we read, and I said, well, we'll put that off for later. Now is later. That where it says the sons of the gods, the B'nai Elohim, sons of God or sons of the gods, have sex with human women and give birth to these giants, who then appear at various other stories later on in the text. How could that be? And people read that as a monotheistic text, and they say, but how could that be? It's saying explicitly that there are gods and they're having sex with women. But it's in Genesis 6. It's when there are still gods. I remember a conference we had with a lot of the best scholars in the world where we got into the usual arguments about when Israel became monotheistic and in which texts it was. And I remember I said, well, the J text is monotheistic. And they said, oh, no, they're those sons of the gods in Genesis 6. That's J, and they're there, and they're having sex with women. And I said, well, that's just the one story at the beginning. And, a colleague laughed at me, said, just one story. But, I mean, well, that's not an answer. And he was right. I can't just say, well, it's just one story. But now because then I didn't know what I know now. What I understand now is right. It's in Genesis 6. You can still have gods in Genesis 6. But starting at Genesis 11, they're starting to fade away. So, for example, in the Exodus story, God says, I will render judgments on the gods of Egypt. And there, too, the translators and the commentators go through all these same kind of issues. It's, I will render judgments on the gods of Egypt. Well, there shouldn't be any gods of Egypt. But then you go, wait a minute, look at the wording there. I will render judgments. It's not, I will defeat the gods of Egypt. I will not destroy the gods of Egypt. I'm not going to show that the gods of Egypt aren't gods. It's none of that. It's, I will render judgments on the gods of Egypt. That was the wording in Psalm 82, that God judges among the gods, and he renders judgment on them. And so presumably this would imply that at the Exodus there's still some Egyptian gods still alive, and one by one they're being done away with. So that's why the first plague is, what's the most prominent Egyptian god in almost all periods is the sun. And the first plague is God turns off the sun for 3 days. And you can't say, well, it's an eclipse. Eclipses don't last 3 days. 3-day eclipse, no more Earth. I mean, that doesn't happen. And a lot of other things. No Pluto, but that's not a planet anymore anyway. But no Jupiter. So it would mean there are the gods of Egypt, but then they're gradually being done away with. So even the old Song of the Sea then starts to fit in nicely. Right after the Exodus, it says, who is like you among the gods, O Lord? Yeah, because you still got some then. Now, it's such an old song that it may be that the author of the Song of the Sea, or authoress, may really have thought that there were gods, period, and that's the end of it. But the point is, now that it's placed in the context of the other sources of the Bible, it fits. You could say, who are like you among the gods, who still won't be around pretty much longer, and then you get rid of the gods. So, what should we do with this? You've got now the author of Genesis 1, which is the author of the P text. You got the author of Genesis 3 and 11, which is the J author. You got the author of the Song of the Sea, the Song of Moses, rather, in Deuteronomy 32. You've got the author of Psalm 82. So you've got at least 4 very major, prominent authors of the Bible with this concept that there used to be gods, but they're gone now. Now, where does a theology like that come from? And I think it's from, the question with which we began, which is, when monotheism started to catch on, whatever century that was, what did you tell your kids? So when the kid says, there's only one God, Mommy? Yeah. But Grandma worshipped many gods. Was Grandma bad? No, honey. Grandma wasn't bad. The gods were bad, so they all died. And now they're gone. Grandma was okay, but now there's only one God, and that's the one we worship. But Mommy, my Canaanite friend at school worships lots of gods. Yes, honey. A lot of people still worship the gods because they don't realize that the gods have died. So that's okay. We let the Greeks and the Romans, they can do whatever they want. But they're foolish if they worship statues. That we know that's wrong. Idols is wrong. But if they still worship the gods, that's their business. So you notice in the Bible, it is never criticized for a pagan to be a pagan. You can never execute a pagan for worshiping their gods. You can execute an Israelite for worshiping Baal. But you can't worship a Canaanite for doing that. You can't execute a Canaanite. You can't execute a Greek for worshiping Zeus. So it's understood other people can worship, as they wish. But they're wrong because those gods died. Now, why didn't we notice this before? Why is this just coming out now? Well, because the monotheists won. And so gradually, all the kids went to Sunday school, and they were taught there's only Saturday school, whatever they had in ancient Israel. They went to school, and they learned there's only one God, and you grew up with that. And then when there were these passages in the Bible that were written during that period where they were first developing this theology, we gradually threw those out. We became so persuaded in the Western world, the three majorist religions of the Western world, with Judaism, Christianity, Islam's teaching there's only one God, and that's the way it is, and Baha'i as well, and that there's only one God. Once you had that as a doctrine, then this earlier doctrine that there used to be gods but now they're dead, that just went away. That didn't fit well, especially when the world of the Near East encountered the world of Europe, which is to say when the Jews met up with Greeks and Greek philosophy. And there started to be more interest in logic and theology and looking at the consequences of this. And when you put those two together, the world of ancient Israel and the world of ancient Greece, and you put them together, what you get is Christianity, a religion that's deeply interested in theology. There are 3 professors in our department out of 14 or 15 who do theology. And they're not doing Muslim theology or Jewish theology. It's a classic, famous old line, Jews don't do theology. When I was a student at Harvard Divinity School, this was a Christian divinity school, and there's me, and I went to my teacher, G.E. Wright, who was the leading Old Testament theologian in America, and I told him I wanted to study theology. And he looked at me like, what? Because he'd always heard Jews don't do theology, and the weird thing that happened is that there was another student earlier that day, John Levinson, who's Jewish, who went to G.E. Wright and said, I want to study theology with you. So he got 2 in one day saying they wanted to study theology. So maybe you guys do that after all. But I can tell you, I also spent 3 years in a Jewish seminary where there was one theology course, and it was one of those ones like, you got to take it, but that's not what's going to get you graduated. Talmud, Bible, that's what those are the courses that matter. But you took the theology course because it was much more fun. You could relax. You didn't have to take as many notes. And the name of the school was the Jewish Theological Seminary. It's still there, Broadway and 122nd Street. And the Jewish Theological Seminary, we would joke that it was called the Jewish Theological Seminary when there was this thing that Jews don't do theology. And in fact, I remember there's a guest lecturer once who quoted that famous line, I think it was from Napoleon, that the Holy Roman Empire wasn't holy, wasn't Roman, and wasn't an empire. And we all looked up at the sign over the name of our place, and So that was a little harsh, but not me. He was being harsh. And I had a professor, Moshe Zucker, a very sweet old man. And he taught Talmud, but he knew philosophy too. He was a scholar of Sadya, which was a Jewish philosophy written in Arabic. And Dr. Zucker said to me, he was talking about, Martin Buber and Abraham Joshua Heschel, the 2 well-known Jewish theologians of the last 150 years. And Heschel was a professor right there at the seminary. So, Dr. Zucker knew him, and Zucker said to me, Friedman, this Buber and Heschel, I don't know what they want. And that was his understanding of theology. And my great colleague in theology here, Professor Will Power, I've often, whenever he starts to talk to me about theology, and we start talking, I said, I quote Dr. Zucker to him. I said, but remember I told you, he said, Friedman, I don't know what they want. And that doesn't stop Professor Power. He still wants to talk theological questions with me, but I admit I'm kind of lost in it. And with the rise of Christianity, though, especially, and then its impact retroactively on Judaism as well, there was a notion, you get more notions about God is unchanging, God is universal, God is absolute, all these kinds of concepts that you can get here in a theology course that haven't come up at all here in a course that we've had now that's like 3/4 over or more in the Bible itself, where they're not getting into a lot of theological issues. You haven't seen much going on in the Bible where somebody is musing about what is the nature of God. It just says, and God appeared unto, and God said unto. It's the story of what God does and what God says is what matters in the Hebrew Bible. But there's no discussion about like the nature of God, the way in pagan religion you knew the nature of the sun god and of the wind god and of the sea. But what's the nature of Yahweh? Nobody knows. You don't get to see him. Moses gets one glimpse from the back. That's it. So this doctrine develops that God is unchanging, God is everywhere, God is sexless when the gods were all male and female. And so retroactively, we read Genesis 1, and it says, let us create humans in our image, and people will come up with every answer to explain that, except the one that's in all likelihood the correct answer, which is he's talking to the gods. And then you go, so there are gods? You go, no, there used to be, but they died. Now, is that such a crazy concept that gods can die? Well, no. When you study the literature of the religions of the ancient Near East and pagan religion, gods die all the time. There's the death and rising gods. Death and resurrection is a common notion about the gods in the ancient Near East. The Canaanite gods, they're all killing each other. Baal and Yam and Mot, they all kill each other. The Babylonian creation epic that we started with, the Mesopotamian epic, the Enuma Elish, is all the young gods led by Marduk or Enlil kill the old gods, which is to say their parents and grandparents, and make the universe out of them. So the notion of gods killing gods was in the air. Nobody would have considered it crazy when whoever wrote Psalm 82 wrote Psalm 82. All right. So there's a notion of many gods. But I've only talked now in terms of many versus one, which is how we monotheists usually put it. But there's another choice. Two. One, two, and many. Now, in our culture, we only talk about singular and plural. And grammatically, that's what we do. And you should probably consider yourselves lucky for that. That when you had grammar, whenever it started, whether it was in first grade or 12th grade, or some people first get it in college, some people never want to know about grammar. But when you learn, there's person, gender, and number, and number is singular or plural. In some languages, number is not just singular or plural. It's singular, dual, and plural. That there's a different grammatical form for saying one thing, for saying many things, and for saying when there's just two of something. One of the languages that does that, as a matter of fact, is Hebrew. In Hebrew, you've learned that plurals have im on the end, like Elohim, and that's why the word for God and the word for gods can be the same word. And words that aren't plural don't have im on the end. But there's also, just as im on the end of a word is a plural, ayim at the end of a word is a dual. So a leg is a regel, legs is raglayim. A hand is a yad in Hebrew. Hands, we always say yadayim. Anything that there's two of in your body ends in ayim. And there's some really bad, dirty jokes in Hebrew about that, but I'm not going there. A friend of mine, when he went over to Israel for the first time, he was doing like a junior year abroad, and he learned this. He thought that was the funniest thing he ever learned, and he would talk about, like Rolls-Royce IM, and he started putting IM on the end. I have two Rolls-Royce IM. I have two, yeah. And it does actually come in handy. But the point of it is not just a grammatical point. It is a conceptual point. That languages that do that have the idea that two of something is as conceptually different from 3 or 10 or a million as one is conceptually different from 3 or 10 or a million. That the two of something is different. It's its own category, like one is. Now that's a tremendous distinction. If you spoke a language that had duals, you'd probably just consider it, one extra burden that you had to learn in grammar. But it's not that hard. I mean, you see IM, there's two, okay? I mean, it's not a big deal. Where it gets confusing is if you have a lot of things that come in twos. So if you say, 100 hands were raised in class, you still say yadayim. You use the dual for that, even though you're talking about 100 of them. So things that are normally, it gets interesting. But the reason you have those issues is because it is a different concept of number from what most of us have in our particular culture. Now, apply that to gods. If you believe in one God, or if you believe in many God, monotheist, polytheist, we get it. But there is another possibility, which is you have two. Some people would say that about Zoroastrianism, where there are two forces, but I've always been unclear as a non-Zoroastrian as to whether Ahriman, he's the dark side of the force. I mean, one is the god of light and one is darkness, but it's not clear if both of them are gods or if it's really only Ahura Mazda, the god of light, who is God, and the other is higher than Satan, lower than a god. I mean, somewhere else. And he's supposed to lose in the end, which is good. He's like the emperor, it's like that. And the emperor is a figure in a movie called Star Wars, a series of motion pictures, soon to have a sequel, if the actors live a little longer. So there is an interim stage where in ancient Judah they believe in Yahweh and his Asherah. In ancient Judah and in ancient Israel. In 3 places we have gotten inscriptions that say Yahweh ve'Asherato, Yahweh and his Asherah. One of them in particular is on the side of this big giant, it's like a vase container thing, but it's big enough like for a couple of us to get in. And it is now sitting in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. You can go see it. And it's interesting, if you go in the inscription room, it's behind glass, and it has graffiti on it. And it's a graffito. 1 graffito, 2 graffiti. It's a graffito. I thought of this while I was eating one spaghetto last night. That's written on it that says Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah. Asherah's a goddess. And it's turned so that, and it's behind the glass case, so you can't see the side that says that. There is a little sign on the side that describes it and has a picture of it, but for some reason they don't want you looking at the original. And but you can see it, even though it's gotten kind of old and kind of reddish on the side of the container. It's definitely readable, and it has a picture of 2 figures over it. So it says Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah, and over it there are 2 pictures sitting, these characters. And if you can bring up Yahweh, you Google Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah, and you can look at the picture for yourself. And some say it's a male and a female. And and it goes with the words Yahweh and his Asherah. Others say, no, those are two separate graffiti, like, you know, you've seen sometimes chains of graffiti on the wall where somebody draws something, somebody else draws something else, or somebody crosses out, or somebody, you know. So it's not, and this thing's covered, there's graffiti all over it, so you don't know if they're by the same person, but it is directly over the wording, you can see that. One scholar has argued, several scholars have argued that the figures on that drawing are Bes figures, which is an Egyptian deity, Bes, which would both be male, so that it's not Yahweh and his Asherah in the picture. And they point out on this that, and you can look at the picture, both of them have some long thing hanging down in between their legs. And so they say that's a penis and these are both males. Now, I've looked at it many times. It's not clear. First of all, their knees are bent. They seem to be like sitting, in which case the thing in the back could be the back leg of the chair. Or it could be a tail. It could be, I don't know what. It is not obvious that it is male genitals. So all I know is there's two figures, and one of them has a beard and one of them has breasts. I don't know, call me crazy. I think it's a male and a female. But I understand that there are responsible scholars who disagree. But none of us disagree about the wording. It's that Yahweh has an Asherah. Now, in the book of Jeremiah, Jeremiah is very harshly critical of the people for worshiping a goddess. And she is referred to as the queen of the skies, the queen of the heavens. And it's not that he's criticizing the people for not worshiping Yahweh. It's that he's worshiping them for dealing this queen of heavens. My colleague here always says what they say is, Jeremiah says to the people, you're bad because you're baking cookies for the queen of heaven. There's a reference to some kind of wafer, I don't know, is a pre-Christian concept, I don't know, but some kind of wafer or cookie or something was used as part of the religious ceremony for the goddess of the skies. And Jeremiah keeps criticizing the people for doing this, and they believe in a goddess alongside the God so strongly that when everything Jeremiah predicts comes true, the Babylonians come, they defeat the Jews, they destroy the city, they destroy the temple, all these terrible things happen, and Jeremiah says to people, you see, it's because of what I told you. It's that you were worshiping the queen of heavens, you were baking cookies for the queen of heaven. And the people answer Jeremiah, no. As long as we were baking cookies for the queen of heaven, everything was all right. It's when we started listening to you and stopped doing it that all this bad stuff happened to us. So go ahead, be a prophet. I mean, even when you're right, you can't win. But they were not ready to give up their goddess. As most people, most people are not quick to give up their God. Well, in our generation, a lot of people are quick to give up their God, but And so it took an additional step. So when you get to the period of Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther, we're done with all this goddess stuff. But it's perfectly understandable that even in a stage where the ancient Israelites and Jews were prepared to give up the worship of the gods, but still, I have a wife, God must have a wife. Humans come male and female, the gods must come male and female. So they're going to keep at least one girl around. And we saw some evidence of this in the story. Remember when we were reading in 1 Kings, I talked about the event at Mount Carmel, where there are 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah on one side, and there's only Elijah for God on the other side. And remember, the fire comes out of the sky, it swallows up the altar, it does good. And then Elijah says, get those prophets of Baal. Don't let one of them get away. And they get them, they massacre them. They kill the 400 prophets of Baal there. They don't kill the 400 prophets of Asherah. Why? My great colleague David Noel Friedman said, the winner gets the girl. They still believe in the goddess. They don't kill the, she is not a threat to Yahweh. Baal is a threat to Yahweh. They finally got rid of this so successfully that Jews and Christians and Muslims today, I mean, we've wiped it out. We don't think about that. Even though, I mean, there it is explicitly in the Bible that the Jews were worshiping a goddess, and, you know, the whole community worships the goddess alongside Yahweh, and they were okay with that. And it took another jump of mind to get down to only one. And that, in a sense, was more transformative than giving up the many. Because once there's only one, not two, the whole question of sex becomes different. If there's only one God, no sex. I think the feminine is such a necessary element of religion that people were very slow to give that up. And so eventually in Judaism, they developed the concept of the Shekhinah. It becomes known enough that when I tell Jewish people that the word Shekhinah never once occurs in the Bible, they're always surprised to hear it. It's a word that means the divine presence. And it became big really in the medieval world with the rise of Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, which plays up the Shekhinah as sort of like a feminine entity with a life of its own. That it's not just this word for the divine presence, it's a feminine thing. And it's interesting that the promotion of Mary, I'm told that in Catholicism, Mariology became a big issue and more study of it around the same time that the Shekhinah concept was developing in Judaism. That it's hard to give up the feminine aspect. You'll see in the earliest prophets, like in Hosea, it's God marries Israel, and Israel is the wife of God. Now that's at the same time that he's teaching, because there ain't no more queen of heaven. Now you say, but wait a minute, if God in Psalm 82 condemned all the gods to death, why didn't the Asherah die then too? Because he condemned all his children to death. It's the B'nai Elohim, the children of God, are all the gods and goddesses. He didn't kill his wife. It's the children. As many parents have often thought about, you know. So, I'm going to kill those kids, you know. But they really did, you know. Now, when did this happen? I lied. At the beginning I said, I don't care when it happened. I don't care if it was the 9th century, the 4th century, whatever. My interest is how did they relate to it, whichever century was the century where it caught on. But I do admit that I care. It is a common view in biblical scholarship for a long time now that they didn't really become monotheistic, really properly monotheistic, until the Second Temple period. Now, I told you also that those people who claim that the whole thing is made up, make it in the Persian or even Greek, the Second Temple period. Everybody loves the Second Temple, apparently. The good guys and the bad guys. But they imagine that the Jews became monotheistic at the point when they were exiled. Because now you've got Jews living in Babylon and Jews living in Egypt, after 587, after the Babylonian destruction. And they don't know what to make of that. So the famous psalm here, that takes place by the rivers of Babylon, which is now a reggae song, was it 137? Says, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and we wept when we remembered Zion. It's the people in exile in Babylon are so sad, having lost their homeland. But one of the lines of the song is, how they demanded that we sing a song of Zion. The Babylonians demanded of us that we sing a song of Zion. How can we sing a song of Zion on a foreign land? How can we sing a song of Yahweh on foreign soil? And then it's the famous, if I forget you, O Yahweh, may my right arm forget. That is, can you sing a song of Yahweh outside of Israel? Their doctrine was that, remember when he bumped off all the other gods, he kept Israel, in fact, earlier, when he distributed all the nations to God, he made Israel the one he picked. And then he makes the covenants with Abraham and with Moses and David. So they had a legitimate question. Most all countries had a national God. And now they were saying, well, can you worship Yahweh? Is Yahweh still the God in a foreign land? And so scholars derived this, not from any evidence in the text, but just logically derived the idea that the Jews didn't really get monotheistic until they were in exile in Babylon. And that's where it all develops. And the reason their reasoning behind that is they say there's no clearly monotheistic statements in the Bible until you get to that stage, and it's in a prophet who's called the second Isaiah. Now, if you look in your Bibles, you will not see the book of 1st Isaiah and the book of 2nd Isaiah, but the book of Isaiah, which is very long, it's 66 chapters, understands to break starting at chapter 40, and it's by a different prophet later, a prophet living in the exile, and he's called the second Isaiah. And it's in that section, in Isaiah 44:6. Isaiah quotes God saying, I am first, and I am last, and outside of me there is no God. Now that's pretty darn monotheistic. So they say that's where monotheism begins. And I go, wait a minute. There's no monotheistic statements prior to that? And I go, well, in the story of Elijah at Mount Carmel, he says to the people, if Yahweh is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. When I imagine all the Israelites in that story are probably going, we'll follow both. And he's not allowing for that. And he didn't say, if Yahweh is the God of Israel, follow him, and if Baal is the God of Israel, follow him. He just said, if Yahweh is God, follow him, and if Baal is God, follow him. To me, that's monotheistic, and that's a very early text. It's absolutely during the days of the First Temple. Whichever century you place it, it's early. Not just when it happens, but I mean even whenever the author lived is early. Or how about this? You read Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy 4:35 it says, Yahweh, he is God. There is no other outside of him. That's almost the same words as 2nd Isaiah. And that's DTR 1. Meaning it's like 7th century, Josianic. So if you put that to a biblical scholar who says, no, there's no monotheism until 2nd Isaiah, you go, well, what about Deuteronomy 4:35? It's almost the same words. They say, no, that's not DTR 1, it's post-exilic. Problem solved. Or 4 verses later, in Deuteronomy 4:39, it says, and you shall know today and store it in your heart that Yahweh, he is God in the skies above and on the earth below. There isn't another. And they'll answer, no, it's not DTR 1. It's later, but it isn't. Or how about Deuteronomy 32? Now we started with that. That's the Song of Moses where he talks about, that there were these gods at the beginning. But later in the same psalm, in Deuteronomy, same song, in Deuteronomy 32:39, it says, I am he, and there is no God with me. Now that fits with that theology I was talking to you about at the beginning. All in the same Deuteronomy 32. There used to be gods. At the time, the highest distributed the nations, they were gods, but now I am he, and beside me there is no other. Psalm 18 is one of the oldest psalms. I told you that it was originally the work of Frank Moore Cross and David Noel Friedman. Their original work that they did picked 5 songs that they said were the 5 oldest things in the Bible. One of them is Psalm 18. And in Psalm 18, verse 32, it says, who is a God outside of Yahweh, and who is a rock outside of our God? Which we could argue about a little, but it's close. That is to say, there are a lot of references to monotheism prior to the exile. And there's all the ones with which we started, which are all pre-exilic texts that say, they have the idea there used to be gods, but now there's only one. And I throw into all of this the notion of centralization. The centralization of religion, remember, starts with King Hezekiah, where you're only allowed to have one temple and one place of worship of God. And that is a profoundly monotheistic thing to do. I said at the time when we were looking at that, when we see that there are synagogues all over the world or churches all over the world, we don't imagine that Christians are worshiping different gods in each of those different churches. We get that there are a lot of different buildings, but they're all for one God. But that's because monotheism has won. But in these early days, when the monotheists are fighting a battle to get the people to accept monotheism, they don't want to have a temple in Jerusalem and a temple at Carmel and a temple at Dan, because people will say, then, you know, who do you worship? We worship Yahweh of Jerusalem. Who do you worship? I worship Yahweh of Dan. Like there's different Baals. There'd be different, multiple gods. And so the way you focus monotheism is, you say, one God, one temple, one altar, one acceptable priesthood, one acceptable way to do sacrifice. And if all these stories in the Torah where anybody does anything wrong, they get in trouble for it. And then here's one more you might say is monotheistic. You may have heard of this verse. You shall have no other gods before me. Oh yeah, the first commandment of the 10 commandments. But those who say that monotheism is a late development say that's not a monotheistic statement, it's a polytheistic statement. Because it says, you shall have no other gods before me, meaning there are other gods. And I go, no, wait, before me in Hebrew, it means, you know, in my presence. It's literally, the Hebrew is al panai, which means you shall have no other gods in my face, in my presence. And where isn't in God's presence? So we'll know where these other gods are. Also, it's a linguistic thing, not a theological thing, that I challenged you on other occasions. You know, go try to think of 5 ways to command people to be monotheistic without referring to the thing that they're not supposed to be doing, the gods and all. It's really, really hard. So when you say, you shall have no other gods before me, that's not an admission that there are other gods. It's the way you express a monotheistic commandment. It's easy to make a monotheistic statement. There's only one God. But it's very hard to make a monotheistic commandment. You should only worship one God. And I mean there only is one for you to worship. You need a footnote to do it as a commandment. And last but not least, also from Deuteronomy, the Lord is one. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. One of the most famous verses in the Bible. Jews and Christians know it. Jews are supposed to, by tradition, try to make that their last words before they die. Out of all the verses in the Bible, the Lord is one. And isn't that monotheistic? It's clearly DTR1. It's clearly pre-exilic. And they say, no, that doesn't mean is one. It means, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord alone. Yahweh is our God. Only Yahweh is our God, but it doesn't mean that there's only one God. And I thought, wait a minute. I took Hebrew from Mrs. Rabinowitz in 3rd grade. I was 8 years old, and she taught me the word echad, and it meant one. And I've checked it through the Torah. And in every occurrence, that word means one. And every little kid in Israel who learns to count learns that word, it means one. And everybody who takes Hebrew here, the beginning level of Hebrew, you'll learn from Ms. Smith, echad means one. I go, where in the Torah does echad ever mean only, or Yahweh alone? And the answer is nowhere. They're not facing the most obvious line in the text. The Lord is one. So I admit I went back on it, and I am interested in when Israel became monotheistic. And what this implies is the battle for monotheism may have taken a long time. And it's hard to say when it was that the whole community bought into it and stopped worshiping other gods or goddesses altogether. But very early, I mean, Deuteronomy 32, Psalm 18 maybe, the earliest stages of Israel's existence, there were at least some who really had a doctrine, there is only one God, you worship only one God, that's the way it is.